Hello there everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Elliot Webber and welcome to what is a very hot recording session in my room. Of course, at the minute, we're once again, the UK is going through a heat wave at the minute. So unfortunately, it's 28 degrees roughly, I think was the last time I checked the weather. Probably even hotter because for some reason my room is the hottest room in my house. I don't know why, plus the light isn't helping, but I need decent lighting for these videos. But anyway, welcome to episode 2 of BTCC What If, the recently launched series on my channel where we take certain key points or moments from BTCC in the past or present and just talk about what would happen if it played out differently. Of course, if you haven't seen last week's episode of the series premiere, please be sure to check that out because I think it's a great video to watch, and also it is a very open discussion. I think all of these videos will be open discussions, as of course, as it is a what if scenario, we can really talk about anything within these certain topics. And in today's topic, it is: what if Ford stayed for 2001? So let's get straight into this. So, yep, what if Ford stayed for 2001? And oh my days, this is a video that I had to put in early in the series because this is just something that I think it's topics like this where I think it'll be a great talk. So yeah, of course, as we know, 2001 was the year where the British Touring Car Championship had its first proper major regulations change. Of course, unfortunately, due to the ever-rising costs of the Super Touring Car era, unfortunately, the rules had to be changed. And I think a change that, while some people probably will not agree with, I personally think it would be a great change because, of course, this would be then turning into the era where I believe was the most underrated period of the BTCC, which would be the BTCT era, or the S2000 era, or the mid-2000s era as more commonly known as. Of course, as I mentioned, 2001 will be the first year of these regulations, the first year without Super Touring regulations, the first time with no Super Touring regulations since 1991, so the first time in 10 years that we're seeing different type cars. Of course, Vauxhall very famously launched the Vauxhall Astra, which would of course go on to dominate BTCC for 4 years during this era. Of course, later on down the line, we'd see the Honda Integra be launched, and what a car that was, my personal favourite touring car. And of course, we go on to have some iconic liveries, Tom Chilton's Star Wars livery in his Honda Civic, Halford's as well becoming a bit more iconic, Vauxhall always having some type of red and white involved into their liveries. And of course, legends would be made, legends like Ivan Muller, Jason Plato, James Thompson, Colin Turkington even as well, Fabrizio Giovanardi. They were all legends because of this era. So yeah, as I mentioned, one of the most underrated periods of this era. But of course, with that, it meant new and returning manufacturers into this era, but also meant some leaving for a very long time. And one of those would be Ford, who of course won the championship in 2000. Of course, with the hands of Alain Menu, who would take his second championship and would go on to have what is at the minute statistically the greatest touring car season ever, 12 wins from 24 races, an unreal performance. He, of course, would have a very famous championship battle with teammate Anthony Reid in the Ford Mondeo. So yeah, what would happen if they stayed? Let's talk about that. Well, first of all, I think we need to talk about what car they'd use, and I think, you know, as Ford, it would be manufacturer, which means they'd get the latest stuff, which meant, of course, latest brakes, car parts, engines, whatnot, and of course, latest cars. Of course, touring cars in the 90s were sort of used as a showcase for manufacturers to showcase their latest sort of family saloon cars, and I think that still would be quite a similar thing, but at the same time, in the later time, in sort of the mid to late 2000s, it would more or less, teams would use cars purely based on their performance rather than it just being a, hey, we're a manufacturer, we need to showcase our latest car that we're releasing. So yeah, but I think to keep it, you know, to keep it a little bit realistic, I unfortunately don't think that Ford would actually use a hatchback. I actually don't think if Ford was to stay in BTCC till, like, let's say they stay on for 2001 and stay until today, I don't think they'd use a hatchback until 2008, 2009, when where Arena Motorsport introduced the Team A on Ford Focus, I actually think they would keep that sort of saloon spec, which is why I think they would use the Gen 2 Ford Mondeo, which I believe was released in 1999 publicly. I think they'd use that until about 2003, but we're not here to talk about what if Ford stayed until today. We're just here to talk about 2001. So for 2001, I think they would use the Gen 2 Ford Mondeo, a car that honestly I know very little about. I say I'm a car guy, but more or less due to modern cars nowadays that are coming out. I say that, but my dream car is, of course, the Nissan Skyline i32. But anyway, I think it would be a good car. I think it would be a good car used. I think as well, if Ford kept all their people and the team that they used, that was used in 2000, I think this could work. And I think that Ford, of course, a saloon car, is essentially a touring car. I think it very well could work. So yeah, for the car, Gen 2 Mondeo. As for the drivers, of course, we're going to talk about what car they use, which we've already done. The drivers, the car's the car and team's performance, how well they do and where they'd finish roughly in the championship with their drivers and in the team standings. So their drivers. Now, let's not forget, in 2000, well, Ford, they would have Alain Menu, who, of course, would go on to win the championship. Anthony Reid, who finished second, his best ever season performance-wise, and, of course, statistically, I think. And, of course, Ricard Riddell, who moved to Ford in 2000 for Volvo. Of course, that would all change a little bit. Alain Menu, in real life, would not return to BTCC until a one-off in 2007, and then his final full season in 2014, and then, of course, a one-off again in 2015 with Team BMR. Of course, again, as I mentioned, in real life, Alain did not return in 2001. He instead went to the DTM Championship with Opel, funny enough, which of course back then was Vauxhall. So quite ironic how Menu and Muller and Plato were all teammates again, technically, to an extent. Of course, as I mentioned, Anthony Reid, he would stay in BTCC for 2001, moving to, of course, the very now famous, you could say, the green and grey or black MGs who teammated with Warren Hughes for 2 years, and then, of course, Colin Turkington later on down the line. And then as for Ricard Riddell, I believe he went to the European Touring Car Championship, but do let me know if I'm wrong in the comments below. But that is, I do believe Ricard went to the European Touring Cars, which of course is now what would become the World Touring Car Championship, what is now the World Touring Car TCR World Tour, I think is called, something like that. But yeah, so that's what would happen to those three drivers in real life. However, my driver lineup would be a little bit different, and I'm going to have to talk about this because two of these moves do greatly affect the 2001 lineup. So, my first driver, no doubt, is Alain Menu. I think Alain would have stayed with Ford had they stayed in 2001. I think he probably had no reason to leave or switch teams. Of course, aside from the fact he was probably getting a bit more money in DTM than he would have been had he stayed in BTCC, but that's not the case. Here, he would stay with Ford, he would be the number one, would carry the number one, and we'll talk about how I think he'd do later on. The second driver, and this is the big one, I think, the second driver to partner Alain Menu would be James Thompson. That is one of my predictions. Of course, at the time, only had a few race wins, was not a two-time champion, was not one of the greats that we see him as now. I think, again, this would be a really good move, not just for Ford, but for James himself as well. Of course, in reality, he went to what was essentially the second Vauxhall team in what was known as Team Export, but it was essentially the secondary Vauxhall factory team. He was essentially the third driver alongside Muller, Plato, and of course Phil Bennett, who debuted back then. And I think him moving to Ford in this scenario would really help him as well, because he'd have Alain Menu, still probably at the time one of the best touring car drivers in the world, the reigning champion of BTCC. That would be a phenomenal driver pairing, just those two as well. However, I'm going to add a third driver, as I think Ford would need not just star power, but also they need youth for their future, because as we know, Alain Menu, even back in the early 2000s, was already in his mid-30s, I believe, now. So, of course, they need people for the future. I think James Thompson definitely would have been one of them. But then as well, this man who also made his debut in BTCC this same year in 2001, it would not be in that class 1, the touring class. He in real life, he made his debut in a Ford in the production class. And now I think you guys know who I'm talking about. My third driver for this fantasy Ford team for 2001 would be Matt Jackson. Yep, that is right. Menu, Thompson and Matt Jackson all in the same team in a Ford Mondeo for 2001. Come on. I mean, come on. Of course, at the time, James Thompson, as I've mentioned, was not really the top star that he would be in 2002, from 2004, even 2006 when he came for select appearances, even 2009 when he starred in that terrible Honda Civic from 2009 with Team Dynamics. That was one of our worst years. But yeah, James Thompson, who I think at the time was one of the rising stars, obviously I think we saw that straight away from his first stint at Vauxhall in the 90s, that he had a lot of potential to be a champion. And as for Matt Jackson, of course, reality production class race winner, competed for that championship, lost out to, I believe, Simon Harrison, won it in 2001, the production class. Correct me if I'm wrong, I do believe it was Simon Harrison. But yeah, as I mentioned, this lineup I think would be amazing if it happened in real life. Of course, probably not would happen now. James Thompson, I do believe, is happily retired as well, as is Alain Menu, as he mentioned on my interview with him. Go check that out if you haven't already. It's undoubtedly my favourite interview I've ever done. But yeah, prime Alain Menu, of course, James Thompson just before he entered his prime, a rookie Matt Jackson, star-studded lineup, I think. And I think if this lineup were to happen today, it would be mouth-watering. But yeah, so we spoke about the lineup. Now let's speak about how well the team itself would do, and then how well each individual driver would do. So first of all, let's talk about the car performance. Again, we have to talk about the money in this. Of course, as we mentioned, the new regulations, the touring regulations, as I think it was known as, of course, would later adapt the S2000 rules in the mid-2000s as well, which meant, of course, it could compete in the World Touring Car Championship. But again, we're not here to talk about that. I think if Ford had a similar budget to what Vauxhall had in 2001, which I am 99% sure they would have, I think they would have. I think Ford would have gone, okay, we're back for 2001, new regulations, new car, new drivers, 2 new drivers. Let's put all of our money into this like we did in the Super Touring, which is what I think they do. And I think Ford would be a big contender to Vauxhall. I think this would have been a Vauxhall versus Ford battle. I think, as I mentioned, if Ford stayed on for many years in this era of touring cars, they would have challenged Vauxhall. They could have challenged that Honda Integra in 2005 and 2006. And oh my days, I think the battles that we could have had in the mid-2000s with Matt Neal, Plato, Shedden, Giovanardi, Tom Onslow Cole, Colin Turkington, the big names of that era, the battles we could have had Ford stayed on as a factory team. I dread to think the amount of crashes and controversies we could have seen. But yeah, anyway, for 2001, definitely think Ford would be the closest competitor to Vauxhall, who, of course, as we knew, just had better development than Peugeot and MG. Of course, MG, in fact, entered very late into the series because the cars weren't ready. Of course, that Lexus car that had, I think, 3 different drivers, of course, that definitely couldn't compete as that was an independent team. That Alfa Romeo team with Ferrier and Tim Harvey and Dave Pinkney, I think at one point, they were never going to compete with that car either. As for Peugeot, which were the most consistent in real life, they were the most consistently close team, but they had a rookie, Dan Eves, who was not ready for the front. They had Steve Soper, who was washed by that point. And also they had Matt Neal for 1 round, which I think, I'm not too sure why Matt Neal left Peugeot after 1 round, but my oh my, that should have really, Matt should have starred in what was essentially his first factory drive. And then, of course, we had Aaron Slight, who, while he was never going to be a race winner, he was never going to compete at all, if we are being honest. So I think Peugeot, and let's not forget, that team was Vic Lee Racing. Of course, a very controversial man is Vic Lee. Yeah, if you don't know his story, try and look it up because it's definitely somewhere out there on the internet. Vic Lee Racing definitely weren't a front-running team at all, despite the fact they won the championship in 1991 with BMW, with Will Hoy. Yeah, they weren't that team anymore, Vic Lee Racing, and so they definitely weren't going to compete. So it would definitely be, as it was in real life, Vauxhall dominance. But I think if Ford stayed, there would have been a championship battle, not just for the Drivers' Championship, but also for the Teams' Championship. I think Ford would have given it to them, and that would have been so exciting to see. As for the drivers, well, how well would they perform? Starting off with Alain Menu, of course, if we're going by what I think would happen, and that is if Ford were a genuine championship competitor, we would have 1000% seen a three-way championship fight between Muller, Plato and Menu. Three of the biggest names in touring cars at the time fighting for what I believe was still the most competitive and greatest touring car championship in the world. The battles we could have seen, and I think the battles we would have seen would have just been amazing. But who would come out on top? That's for you to decide. Who do you think would come out on top with those three? As for James Thompson, I think it would be eerily similar to his real life 2001 season, where he would definitely have some race wins in there, but unfortunately he would not be consistent enough to challenge for the championship. I definitely think he would be that perfect number 2 driver to Alain Menu, whereas, so for example, had, let's say, Alain got taken out, or he crashed out by himself, he made a mistake, or if just something happened with the car, if the car broke down, James Thompson would be that driver to pick up Alain's lost points, which would help James and not only Ford in the championship. I definitely think that James Thompson would be that driver that would help Ford compete with Vauxhall. So I definitely don't think, whilst I think Alain would 1000% have beaten both Thompson and Jackson in the standings, I definitely think the top 4 in the championship would be Menu, Thompson, Plato and Muller in any of that order. Honestly, I think at certain points when Thompson would have had great races, I think he would also be an actual outsider and a dark horse for the championship, when the times that Muller, Plato and Menu would slip up at some point, because they did. There was a lot of slip-ups in 2001. Of course, there were many iconic moments between the Muller and Plato battle in real life that probably cost each other more points than it should have done. For Thompson, podiums, race wins, but unfortunately it would not be enough to compete for the championship. He'd have to wait until 2002 potentially. As for Matt Jackson, I think he'd have something similar to Dan Eves. I think it would be him and Eves and one of the export guys battling for 5th in the championship whilst that top 4 ran away. I think Matt Jackson would have a few podiums. I think he'd definitely have a 2nd place in there, but unfortunately I do not think he'd have the pace nor the experience to compete for race wins, not until maybe 2002 or 2003. Again, that would have been if Ford stayed for a long, long time. But yeah, for Matt Jackson, I think it would be a steady rookie season. I think he definitely would compete with Dan Eves for that Rookie of the Year championship. And I think he definitely has some great battles with Phil Bennett and Steve Soper, because those two had some battles themselves. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That is what I think would happen if Ford stayed in the BTCC for 2001. Let me know your guys' thoughts though in the comments below. What do you think would happen if Ford stayed in the championship? Would they be a championship contender? Who do you think their driver lineup would be? And if Menu stayed with Ford, how would that 2001 championship battle play out? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Of course, if you are new around here, be sure to like this video, share with your mates as well, because it of course does help my channel grow. And of course, press that subscribe button, because we are firmly on the road to 200 subscribers. We are trying to hit 200 subscribers by the end of the year. Of course, as I mentioned, if you haven't watched the first episode of BTCC What If, go check it out, because I think you're missing out. And the next episode is going to be another tasty one as well, because episode 3 is what if Ash Sutton and Josh Cook stayed at MG beyond 2016. So let me know your thoughts on what you think would happen with that scenario. And of course, let's talk about this scenario as well, because I think this is probably going to be my favourite that I make. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.